There we are. Hello. Um, I, as you said, I get to talk about anything. I was trying to think about what might be particularly relevant to this group, and so I have focused in on the work that I've been doing on research ethics and public data, which started in 2016. This is part of the larger NSF-funded Pervade project, of which Michael Zimmer, who's also here, is a part. And we're sort of wrapping up now, but everything continues. So this is about 7 years worth of work, and I have tried to make this a short presentation, about half the size as I'm normally used to. So I'll mention some things at the end that I'm not talking about here in case anyone wants to talk about those as well, because there are some other sort of side aspects of some of this. I'm trying to focus in. So I sometimes joke that being a tech ethicist means that I just make slides that look like this over and over until I retire. And I think that's something that a lot of people are familiar with, is this idea that like our data, our content is being collected and used in some way without us realizing it. This comes up in the context of facial recognition. More recently, we see a lot of headlines like this related to generative AI. Oh my gosh, my tweets and my blog posts and my fan fiction, which is what this article is about actually, are being used to train ChatGPT. Oh my gosh. And I think that for a lot of people, this is the first time they're encountering that idea that someone, a big tech company or researchers or whatever might be using their content. But very occasionally this comes up in this sort of pure science researcher kind of way as well. So you probably have heard of various controversies like this over the years. One that comes to mind was the Stanford gaydar study, which was controversial for a lot of reasons, but one thing that people didn't talk about as much was like, how do you think that was trained? It was from photos from dating sites, which is where you get photos labeled with sexual orientation to train an algorithm. So we've seen a lot of these kinds of things. One that also comes to mind for me was in 2016 when a researcher scraped all of OkCupid and then just put a data set on the internet without any anonymization or anything. And if you use OkCupid, you know what kinds of data is in that data set. And when called out for it on Twitter, the researcher said the data is already public. And this is a very common justification for this. I mean, it's the justification for researching public data. I took these slides out of my talk, but one of the reasons that this happens is because in the United States, at least, institutional review boards at universities do not consider use of public data to be human subjects research. And unfortunately, a lot of researchers are trained to think that ethics means what the IRB tells you can and can't do. And so if they don't think it falls under their purview, then of course it can't be unethical. But this is such a common sort of justification that Michael was writing about this in 2010. And I also understand has a Google alert for this term. So we hear this a lot, right? And this idea of like, well, the data is public and therefore we can do whatever we want with it has resulted in some kinds of research that are incredibly common. And one thing that always sticks out at me was a point that Zeynep Tufekci made in 2014 in a paper about the pitfalls of big data research. And she said that Twitter is like a fruit fly. We don't research Twitter because it's the best thing to research. We research Twitter because it's the easiest thing to research, like a fruit fly. Like fruit flies are not like magically, the best, or they just have such short lifespans. So they're very easy to research. And so Twitter similarly has this like microorganism problem. I mean, maybe not anymore. Twitter is not as easy to research as it was a year ago, but you see the point here. So the first work that I did in this space was with my collaborator Nick Preferis, and this was I would say that a lot of conversation around this kind of thing sort of started with the Facebook emotional contagion study and people realizing that like, oh, we should be thinking about research ethics on social media. And one thing that was starting to be discussed was like, I wonder if all that public data we're using, like, should we be thinking about that or should we not care about it because IRBs don't care? And so we had a very simple research question, which was, how did Twitter users feel about this? And we did a survey. I won't bore you with the details. There's a paper, but one of the findings that I thought was very interesting was that most people in our survey, and again, this was a survey, so people opted in to participate. It was on Mechanical Turk, so people who understand that research exists in the world, right? And even then, most people had no idea that this happens. And anecdotally, having talked to a lot of people about this over the years, this is a weird concept for people. Like, why would scientists be reading my tweets? Is a very common reaction to talking about this. And I will say that like years ago, a Twitter engineer was like giving a talk in my department about like data and Twitter. And I said, well, how do you reconcile like the fact that people don't know that their data is being used by researchers? And he said, oh, they absolutely know because it's in the terms of service. Anyway, people do not know necessarily. And also almost half of the people in our sample thought that this definitely is not allowed. That like it was against ethical rules or it was against the terms of service or that sort of thing. And we weren't interested in this work and thinking about like, is using Twitter data good or bad, or should you do it or shouldn't? We were interested in the sort of contextual factors that impact how people feel about this. And so I do not expect you to get meaning from this chart, but what you see here is how different factors influence people's level of comfort with their tweets being used in research. So there could have been a world in which everyone in our survey was like, why would we care about this? Of course, it's fine. But instead, there are a lot of things that matter, like who's analyzing the data and what you're going to do with it, and how big the data set is, and is it a tweet that was deleted? What is it attributed to me? Is it anonymous? All of these kinds of things matter. And something else, I was trying to figure out where to stick this in the talk, and I decided on here. Hot off the presses. I with some colleagues were doing some work around Mastodon, like Twitter to Mastodon migrations. We did this big survey and had like 1,500 participants talking about Mastodon. And so I decided to throw some research ethics questions in there. And we actually replicated this question about levels of comfort. And again, I don't expect you to take meaning out of this. And I'm about to show you some more graphs also that are very ugly because I generated them about 2 hours ago. But if anyone wants to talk about Mastodon and research ethics, maybe we can come back to these slides if you want to have a better look. But basically, the findings were very similar quantitatively, like the things that impact people's level of comfort. But interestingly, we also asked people about like strategies that Mastodon could use if you are going to get certain types of consent, like should there be opt-in or opt-out at the account level or the instance level, or does that not matter at all because it's public, or should consent be required, and all these sorts of things. And I will say that overall, and based on an open answer response as well, people on Mastodon are more protective of their privacy, I think, than most people on Twitter. And we got a lot of people who are like, I cannot believe that a researcher would even consider collecting data from Mastodon. There were some outraged people because the fact that we asked this question clearly meant that it was something that could happen. Most people actually were suggesting that an opt-in at the account level would be like the way to do this ethically. Anyway, I'm thinking a lot more about this. I'm happy to talk more. But the TLDR of those studies is that data collection should not be context agnostic. Like, it shouldn't be a, is it public, yes or no? Instead, these other kinds of things matter, right? What kind of data you're collecting, what you're going to do with it, who you are, what the expectations and norms of the users are, such that publicness is obviously not the only context that matters. And I have to put this on the slide because this is a very common ethical heuristic. And I've read many papers where in the methods section, it just says, this data was public without any further ethical reflection. So I want to bring up two examples that were, I guess, egregious enough to spawn Twitter controversies, which is what I'm showing you here as opposed to the actual papers. One of them was a paper where they collected tweets about a particular like mental health community, and the people in that community found the paper and were very mad. And one of they were mad despite, an ethics section in the paper. It had been approved by a university ethics review board. One of the reasons they were upset was that some of the people in the data set were no longer alive, and they thought that was disrespectful. Also, the tweets in the paper had actually been obfuscated so that you shouldn't be able to trace them back, but people recognize themselves in the data anyway. So that was one example. Another example, someone wrote a paper where their argument was that because LGBTQ people have privacy concerns, they might be reluctant to participate in research, and therefore it's important that we're able to find them on Twitter so that we can research them anyway. And so they built a machine learning classifier to basically categorize LGBTQ Twitter accounts so that they could know, like, they were looking for keywords. And so if you had, queer in your Twitter bio, their classifier could say, is that a person who we should research? Or is it, an organization or something like that? And they said their IRB approved it. So people were upset about this one as well for, I feel like, fairly obvious reasons. And one of the things here that I think is important is that, like, data is not just, like, this, tweets are not data in the way that, I don't know, weather data or something like that. Like, they might not, a tweet might not be a human, but it is created by a human and implicates a human, and has some impact on humans. So if your only ethical heuristic is the data public or not, then that suggests that this tweet, which I found on Twitter for a talk I was giving in 2018, that this tweet is about what someone had for breakfast is equivalent to a tweet revealing someone's HIV status. And this is an obfuscation of an actual tweet that I found around the same time, because why would I even put it in a talk, right? The idea that these two pieces of data should be treated equivalently and that there is no difference between them when it comes to ethics or privacy is absurd. And there is a lot of research that is on very sensitive topics. One finding that I think is interesting and important, some researchers found a few years ago that 72% of articles on PubMed, which means medical research, like health medical research, 72% of the articles that use Twitter data quoted at least one tweet, and those could lead back to the Twitter user 84% of the time. So you're tweeting about HIV or cancer or bipolar disorder, and someone can put that tweet into the search bar of Twitter and find you. And, this kind of thing does happen. This particular example, incredibly innocuous subject matter, but there was a paper published that was about how people's language on Twitter changes after they get engaged. Like, do they talk more about we or whatever? They had a code book for their tweets, like, here's how we categorize these things. I think it was like a machine learning classifier. And a journalist wrote a story about this paper. And the journalist took these tweets and put them into the Twitter search bar and then contacted the people who tweeted them to talk to them about it. And in this case, like, no harm done, I assume, unless someone was just weirded out by the fact that their tweet was in a scientific paper. But imagine that instead of a tweet about fishing, it was like this was a predictive mental health paper, and a journalist calls you up and they're like, hey, I just read the scientific paper, and this machine learning classifier says that you are severely depressed based on this tweet, right? And again, if our only heuristic is it public, then there's nothing ethically to suggest that you should not do that, that you probably should not quote a tweet in a paper and then have an algorithm diagnose that person, or quote a tweet in a paper where someone reveals their HIV status. And there are cases in which actual harm has been done. So you might have seen this headline in one of my earlier slides. Some researchers collected YouTube videos of people going through gender transition in order to train facial recognition systems. And people were in this data set without their consent and were very upset about it. Again, I feel like for obvious reasons. Not only does it feel like a privacy violation, but in this case, like, you put a video out, putting yourself in a vulnerable position to help your community, and then it is used possibly to build technology that would actively harm your community. And I feel like people put content online for a lot of different reasons, and it's certainly not to be part of scientific research. Another example that comes to mind, there was a paper published where they built a classifier, or they built an algorithm to predict someone's BMI from their photograph. So you can, I guess you can imagine use cases for that. I mean, BMI is trash, but so where did they get the photos from? So these are actual photos. I obscured them even more because I feel like a line across your face, like eyes, doesn't actually obscure your face. But this was in the paper, this photograph with people's photos with BMI attached to it. And they got these photos from a weight loss support subreddit. Which again, so imagine why you would put a photograph of yourself and label it with your weight in an online community. It's like for support, and it's vulnerable. And then now your picture is in this paper. Again, BMI is trash, so like probably building technology that's going to be harmful. So I think that an important point here is that different data is different, but also people are different and in different positions and have different kinds of vulnerabilities. So I'm going to talk now about 3 different studies led by 3 of my PhD advisees that have looked at this issue with respect to different marginalized communities. So the first one was interviews with it was actually people in fandom, but this turned out to also be a proxy for LGBTQ communities. So one of the things that people talked about in these interviews was the vulnerability of the people who you might be collecting data from. So lots of people talked about Tumblr in this context. We were actually asking them about researchers as well as journalists. So one hypothetical that someone came up with was that they had always been worried that there are if like a BuzzFeed article came out that was like, here's a bunch of funny fan art, and it linked back to their Tumblr, that someone in their real life would recognize their art style and then see on their Tumblr that they were queer, and it would out them. So regardless of what the content was, it would put that person potentially in danger. And a lot of people talked about fear of being outed by their content, getting a broader audience than they anticipated and wanted. And another thing that people talked about in this study was like people parachuting into the community and like grabbing stuff and leaving. Like, I don't want researchers who aren't a part of this community just coming in and like taking our stuff, and they're not going to understand us, and they're just parachuting in. Another one of my PhD advisees, Shamika, did a similar study about Black Twitter, and similar kinds of concerns. And someone brought up, for example, very specifically, I remember when this happened, I believe white researcher collected a data set of the Black and the Ivory hashtag and put it online and was like, hey, look, people can use this data set. And people on Black Twitter were very upset about this. And the way that they articulated this here was like, this isn't your data. Like, what gave you the right to do this? And again, it felt different or worse if someone wasn't part of the community. So, they also talked about how like, well, if it was Black researchers and or it's people who are part of Black Twitter, then that would feel different. But like, a bunch of white researchers coming in and just like analyzing, our content, our communities without our consent, it feels weird. And one of the things they pointed out was like, it also matters because of the way that people are reflecting on shared experiences. And it's interesting because we talk a lot about positionality when it comes to qualitative research, like, what's your rapport going to be like with your interview participants? I don't see as much reflection about positionality for this kind of research. But imagine that you were, if you collected a bunch of data from Black Twitter, there's not a single Black person on your research team, and you haven't actually talked to any Black people as part of your research. And now you're like interpreting this data without any lived experience and without actually having talked to people with that lived experience. Another one of my PhD advisees, Blakely, along with some other collaborators, interviewed fat people about their experiences online, people who use the word fat to identify themselves for the most part, and also asked them about research ethics. We actually have a poster coming out at CCW that's about ethically engaging with fat people in research in general, because there's a lot more than just public data issues. But this did come up in the interviews. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was they talked a lot about the importance of intention. So not just who the researchers are, but why they're doing this. So someone, for example, I believe had a bad experience or seen something like this, and they were like, paper, where someone was writing about fat people, and it's clearly because they wanted to paint them in a bad light. And you could see contexts in which this would come up, right? Another thing that I thought was interesting was someone pointed out, like, it matters to me if they're just doing this to advance their career. Like, do they actually want to help us? Is this something that is going to benefit this community? If you think about like basic tenets of research ethics, you know, one thing is you're thinking about like harms versus benefits. And one of the questions is who does it benefit? Does it benefit the people that you're studying without their consent? Because that may make a difference too. And interestingly, one of the findings in the Twitter study was that people wanted to read the paper. Like they definitely wanted to know that their tweet was in a research paper. And think about how rarely that happens. Like almost never, probably. But people were interested. They wanted to know, they wanted to read it. And so the thing that I'm going to end on here is actually talking about some specific kinds of communities. So I mentioned before that like Twitter being the fruit fly of research, shortly after Twitter started undergoing its changes, I thought that, oh, we're gonna have a new fruit fly, and that new fruit fly is Reddit. Which actually, now that a bunch of changes have happened with respect to APIs on Reddit, I'm not sure if that is still the case. However, myself and some collaborators, including Michael, who's here, did a big analysis of papers that use Reddit data. We've already published a paper that's just about like, what is this? What are people studying on Reddit? And one of the answers to that is very sensitive topics a lot of the time. You know, things like r/depression, r/suicide watch, r/bipolar Reddit, r/opiates are in some of the top subreddits studied. And then mental health is one of the top keywords in this set of 700 papers. This makes me think back to that paper about LGBTQ people where they're like, wow, you know, they care a lot about their privacy, so they probably like don't want us to study them, so how do we study them anyway? And I suspect that is part of what's happening with studying mental health communities on Reddit, is that it is hard to study you know, people with mental health conditions. Now, that's not all of it. Now, I'm not saying that this work is bad, and a lot of it is done with very sort of thoughtful ethical considerations. And actually, that was part of what we have subsequently done in this analysis as well, is we looked at ethics sections in these papers. And one thing I will say is that 700 papers, less than 150 said anything about ethics, like very generously defined. If they said this was okay for us to do because the data is public, we counted that. And through that analysis, we came up with some types of best practices that people were actually doing and writing about in these papers, and sort of triangulated these a little bit with some other things that we've seen in our research. I'll also add that on the topic of like the challenges of studying health communities and that sort of thing, a project that has just started in my lab. One of my PhD students is conducting interviews right now with people who share content online about chronic health conditions. And one of the things that they're talking to people about is this concern, like the sort of privacy trade-off here, and research ethics specifically. How do you feel about researchers, you know, being in the r/diabetes subreddit, and in what ways do you try to protect your privacy? How are you making this decision to share information about yourself? Is there a trade-off in terms of getting social support or information, to, you know, sort of making this decision to share this kind of information online? So I am actually going to end there because I would love to have more of a conversation about this. And I'm also happy, I'll add, actually, I mentioned I would do this, a couple of things that I didn't talk about. So I've also I've done a research study about terms of service for data scraping, and TLDR, terms of service is a useless method for making any kind of ethical decision at all. Also did a study about people's reactions to the Facebook emotional contagion study. It's another thing I didn't talk about, but I would love to have a discussion now, and thank you very much for listening.